me, altruism is just about making other people better off. And more precisely, I just want to measure that as just how many people are you affecting and how significantly are you improving their lives. And if in the course of that you improve your own life as well, as I think is actually quite often the case, that's a bonus.
Hey everybody, welcome to another Rollback, where we bring the best of our pre-video catalog to YouTube for the very first time. Today's episode is all about effective altruism, or in other words, what it means to do good better. And our guide for this exploration of philanthropy is the very wise William MacAskill. William is a scholar, he's an author, and an associate professor in philosophy, as well as a research fellow at the University of Oxford. Even more impressively, at the time of our original conversation back in 2015, William was only 28 years old and already had been a research fellow in philosophy from Emmanuel College at Cambridge, as well as a Fulbright scholar at Princeton, and had co-founded 2 nonprofits in his 20s. This is a pretty intense and at times heady conversation that covers a lot of ground, including the definition of effective altruism, the link between altruism and happiness, removing emotion from philanthropy, how to properly evaluate a charity, reasons to choose a career path, and why the sweatshop issue is more complex than you think. William is an exceedingly bright and incredibly impressive young man, and it was an honor and a pleasure to probe his philosophical mind. So I sincerely hope you enjoy this exchange from episode 178 with me and William MacAskill. So many things to talk about, but I think probably the best way to just jump in and get our feet wet. Why don't you kind of explain what effective altruism is, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, terrific. So effective altruism is about using your time and money as effectively as possible to make the world a better place. So if you want to give to charity, how can you make not just a difference, but how can you make the most difference you can? If you want to do good with your career, what's the very best career you can do in terms of having a social impact? And then we try to take a scientific, evidence-based, data-driven approach to answering that question. And that's turned into a bit of a philosophy and a bit of a social movement. And there's now an effective altruism community all around the world. I know.
How does it feel to be at the epicenter of like catalyzing this entire social movement?
Well, I'm
at a spry 28 years old.
Well, I'm British, so mainly I just feel awkward about it.
Right. How embarrassing.
But, how embarrassing, exactly. But I mean, exciting at the same time. It's just, I really didn't expect these ideas to take off in the way they have done. And it's been so exhilarating seeing people really make very significant changes to their life, pledging to give most of the money they earn over the course of their life, making major career switch, founding nonprofits, founding companies, all with the aim of just really trying to make the biggest difference they can.
Right. And we're going to get into all of that. But while we kind of like plant our flag in this world of altruism, I mean, I think that it might make sense to even define altruism in itself, because I feel like it gets confused. Like when I spoke to Ryan about stoicism, it gets confused with asceticism, right? And I feel like, altruism can kind of fall a little bit into that category as well in terms of how people perceive it. So like, what is altruism in and of itself?
Yeah, thanks a lot for asking that. So, because when biologists use the term altruism, they mean self-sacrifice. And I think a lot of people think that. They mean, you're being altruistic, that means you're just making yourself worse off for some other end. And that's not really how I want to use it at all. For me, altruism is just about making other people better off. And more precisely, I just want to measure that as just how many people are you affecting and how significantly are you improving their lives. And if in the course of that you improve your own life as well, as I think is actually quite often the case, that's a bonus. That's a reason in favor of doing that thing, not a reason against.
Is it your feeling that we are naturally altruistic, that through some bizarre, sort of natural selection process that we are, we have arrived on the planet kind of inherently altruistic, or we have that innate sort of characteristic as a precept of natural law?
Yeah, I think we're to some extent altruistic. So maybe we're like 90% out for ourselves and 10% altruistic.
Yeah, I'm not so sure we live in the most altruistic culture.
Yeah, I think It varies depending on which particular subculture you're part of. Maybe Wall Street, not so altruistic, the Baylor a little bit more, at least in how they talk about things. But I think in terms of human nature, I think there's a strong altruistic component.
Right.
I think, we see suffering in other people, even in people we don't know, and we feel compelled to help. Anytime a natural disaster strikes, that's in clear abundance. And it's hard to make sense of that on purely evolution and self-interested grounds.
And so how did you get initially interested in this subject matter?
Yeah, so I'd been interested in doing good. I'd been socially conscious kind of growing up. I ran a scout troop for kids with disabilities for many years. I worked as a care assistant at an old folks home, and that was a really
what were your parents
job.
like?
My parents were fairly regular, kind of upstanding members of the community. They never really pushed me in any direction particularly. They just wanted to see me flourish on my own. And so a lot of this stuff was kind of off my own back.
It's a self-generated thing.
Yeah, and then I became vegetarian age 18. And
I didn't know that.
That was definitely...
That didn't come up in my research. So now we have lots of other stuff to talk about.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So 1st of October, 2005.
Wow.
That was the day I left home. I became vegetarian.
Interesting.
And that definitely wasn't encouraged by my parents. They were quite shocked. And so, I'd always been interested in making difference. And certainly through studying philosophy, a lot of ethical ideas coming up and a lot of arguments I found quite powerful. In particular, Peter Singer's argument that we have this obligation to give most of our income to fight poverty because you wouldn't walk past a child drowning in a shallow pond just because it would cost a few $1,000s for you to run in and save the child and muddy your suit. And if that's true, what's the difference between that child drowning in front of you and a child dying of an easily preventable disease in a poor country on the other side of the world? And I found the argument compelling that there isn't really a morally relevant difference.
Was that an argument that you came upon prior to him sort of entering your orbit and being kind of a mentor to you? Oh,
yeah. I came upon that argument age 18 or 19 and found it very compelling immediately, but didn't act on it, not for years.
Right.
And it was actually only after I graduated Cambridge, which is where I did my undergraduate degree. And over the summer, I was working as a fundraiser for Care International. So one of those annoying people who stands on the street and accosts passers-by, asking them to donate $10 a month. In the UK, we call them charity muggers or chuggers. And so I was a chugger. And it meant that all day, every day, I was telling people about global poverty and how much good you could do just by spending your money in a different way. And every day I was getting these blank, apathetic stares back at me, people who just were making any excuse possible to dodge the arguments. And I thought, these people just aren't living up to their own values. And I felt very angry about that. And then I thought, well, I'm not living up to my own values either. My plans at the time were to go to grad school at Oxford, continuing to do philosophy, but doing very esoteric subjects. Philosophy of language, philosophy of logic, things that I honestly thought were very intellectually interesting, but weren't going to really make a difference to the world.
Not applied philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. And so that meant that when I arrived at Oxford, I thought, okay, I'm going to have to start making changes to my life. And I started giving some of my graduate stipend, like a couple of percent, a few percent, which seemed like a very big deal at the time in my head. And I started looking around, talking to academics, asking, okay, well, including practical ethicists, people who are really engaging with real-world ethical issues and asking, well, what impact did you have? And the chair of practical ethics at Oxford, who must be, within that field, one of the most influential people, asked him, and he said that once someone said that they joined the donor organ registry.
You got one email.
One email, yeah, one person in this 20-year career who'd signed up to dog.
That breaks my heart.
Yeah, and he said that was the sum total of it. So I was pretty disenchanted, and so really wondering what I should do with my life. But then, by coincidence, I met another academic called Agoura Rd, and that was in early 2009. And we met because of shared research interest. But I saw on his website that he had this comment that he says he was very concerned by global poverty and give the required amount. And I saw that and I thought, hogwash. He's just another one of these academics who's not actually doing anything. But then he told me he was at the time living on £9,000, saving £2,000 and giving £2,000.
Wow.
And he was planning to give everything he earned above £20,000. And he described it as a high bar. He was planning to give more than that, in fact, but if he was going to pledge something publicly, he wanted to have a safe amount. But what was most striking about it all was how enthusiastic he was about this. He was not conveying this as this
like
self-flagellating...
like a martyr or something.
Yeah, exactly. He was like, this is this amazing opportunity. This is like so exciting how much good we can do. And that really inspired me as well. And so together we then co-founded this organization, Giving What We Can, which is about encouraging people to give at least 10% of their income to whatever causes do the most good. And I ended up taking a similar pledge to him, everything above £20,000 per year.
Right.
Inflation and cost of living adjusted to Oxford 2009.
Yeah, let's explore that a little bit. So
Okay,
that's about
sure.
$35,000 US, right?
That's
Something
right.
in that range. So did you do that shortly after that conversation, or how long have you been on this program?
Yeah, I think a couple of months afterwards. I actually, it was obviously a time of turmoil for me, and before making the decision, I went online and just started looking at photos of children suffering from horrific diseases. And because, I wasn't, cognitively I thought I should do it, but I didn't quite have the emotional push. So I deliberately looked at photos like that. And I remember seeing one child who had a lymphatic filabiasis of the face. So it's quite a rare condition to get that. It meant the entire face was hugely swollen and like sagging down, almost like Snoopy the dog or something. And I just thought, look, if my action here can stop like one person, just one child, from not having to go through a condition like that, it's easily worth it. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, I can do that thousands of times over. And so that's when I made the decision.
Right. And what did your friends think when you announced this to your peer group?
Well, at the time I was proselytizing quite a bit.
Youth.
Yeah. No. So a lot of people would say, is that legally binding? Come back in a few years and we'll see whether you've still stuck with that.
Well, it's a valid question. I mean, it's one thing to make that pledge when you're an impoverished student, but now you're sort of, as you escalate the world and your income increases. I mean, do you have like caveats for adjusting for not just inflation, but as your life continues to expand? I mean, if you have children, if you know what I mean, like things enter into your life where $35,000 a year, if you're making a decent quantity, which I imagine you will with all the work that you're doing, you're going to confront like some realities with that.
Yeah. So there are some caveats. So one is for children. So if I'm a parent with another, if I have a child and if I'm a parent with a partner, then I would increase it by £5,000 per child, or £10,000 if I'm a single parent. And I also have put in a kind of emergency clause, which is just, if it's the case that something unforeseen happens that I think is, and it's going to significantly impede how much good I think I'll do over the course of my life, then I'll just get permission from Toby and break the pledge. Like, it's not like this kind of crazy thing that I want to stick to, like, even if the consequences were going to be worse.
Right.
It's more just making a clear commitment about this is how I want to live my life.
It will likely present some interesting philosophical, like, slide rule equations because, for example, what if an opportunity arises for you to travel to some place, but there isn't, where you could potentially do some good, but there isn't money to get you there, and that would put you over your budget. Is it more important for you to, as a sort of, emblematic message to the world, to hold true to your pledge, or would it be more positively beneficial for the world for you to break the pledge and then go someplace that costs money to get to enact the good?
Yeah, right? I think, like I say, I'm not doing this for reasons of asceticism. I think, the ultimate justification for doing all this is the outcomes you produce in the world. And so in a case like that, I'd, think of it as a business expense, not count it as something
that would come out of the other side of the equation.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I got you.
But I want to be kind of clear and transparent about that. So, because it's just, if it means that I'm just handcuffing myself in certain cases when I could do more good, then that's exactly against the spirit of why I'm doing this.
Okay, so you make this pledge, which then, bifurcates your income, but then you're presented with this very practical, real-world question, which is also a philosophical question, which is how to allocate this money. And when we kind of look at altruism, it seems to me that that's basically potential energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that potential energy can be expended through finances, through time, right? Mm-hmm. Is that essentially correct? So now you have you have a finite amount of time, and you have this other kind of allocated cash reserve, and then it becomes an issue of like how is this going out into the world into the best way? Which then you run that through your philosophical brain and perform that calculus, and really your life's work is an expression of that. It's like an ongoing expression of how to apply a more scientific method to the allocation of this potential energy so that it enacts the most, quote unquote, good, right? So if we're going to explore that, we should probably first talk about like what is good, like how are you defining good?
Yeah, terrific. So that's exactly right. It's early 2009, and Toby and I, even on a low estimate over the course of our lives, are going to give £1 million, $1.5 million. And the question's just, okay, well, this is a big spending decision. How are we going to use that as well as possible? And so for defining good, obviously it's contested, but I think one thing that all kind of plausible moral views agree on as at least part of the truth is about what makes for the good outcome is the sum total of improvements to people's lives. So if I can extend your life if you're happy, that's improving the quality. That's improving your life. If I can increase the quality of your life while you're alive, that's improving your life as well. And that's what I take the core of altruism to be, is just improving other people's lives. And if you can improve more people's lives, that's better. If you can improve people's lives by a greater amount, that's better too. And there might be other things that go into good outcomes, like art for its own sake and knowledge for its own sake, the preservation of the natural environment for its own sake, not just in terms of how those things translate into improvements in people's lives. But there's at least one thing that everyone can agree on, which is that just making people suffer less, making people happier is a good thing to do.
Right.
And that's what I tend to focus on.
Right. So you have this experience as a chugger.
Yeah.
and are getting, they're saying talk to the hand, and you're realizing this is a broken system, like trying to get people to act, in an altruistic way, whether logically or emotionally, is a hurdle. And then your focus sort of looks at, kind of the corporate environment of giving in general, and also realizing that is broken. Like there's got to be a better way to give, to help, to be altruistic. So let's look at that for a minute. Like what is the culture? What is the environment of charity and giving, and why is it broken?
Yeah. Okay, great. So there were two differences. One is that a move from just thinking of charity as this thing you do, like a couple of pounds, a couple of dollars a month, and actually taking it seriously, making it a significant part of your life. So that's one aspect. But then the second is thinking about outcomes with respect to charity. Rather than having this donor-centric philanthropy where you give to the causes you personally feel connected with or personally feel passionate about, instead thinking, well, what are the charities that are going to have the best outcomes, that are going to do the most good, measured in terms of improvements to people's lives. And I think most people would think, oh, well, that's just an impossible question, you can't answer it. But actually, there's a large body of research from health and development economics that can help you to answer that question. And that research was primarily designed to advise developing world governments on how they could best spend their scarce resources. But exactly the same research could be used to advise us on how we should spend our scarce resources when giving philanthropically. And they came up with a metric called a QALY, or Quality Adjusted Life Year, which is just a way of measuring these two ways of benefiting someone, extending their life or improving the quality of life that someone has while they are alive. And using that metric, you can look at all sorts of different health programs, treatment for HIV/AIDS, or condom distribution, or distributing bed nets, or providing deworming, all sorts of things, and look at and assess them and compare them in terms of the impact they have in people's lives. And then you can pick the best, the one that has the biggest improvements.
Right. So essentially taking emotion out of it.
To some extent.
In certain respects, right?
Yeah.
And as I'm kind of grappling with that, I can't help but think that, giving is inherently it's a very emotional act for a lot of people, right? It's people gravitate towards the causes that they feel personally connected to. So in some respect, you're saying that's fine, but that's not a great way of going about it.
Yeah. So an analogy is maybe with being a doctor. So if you're a doctor, then you might want to say, caring for the sick is an inherently emotional enterprise. You don't want to take the emotion out of that. But if you're a professional doctor and you're doing that all day, every day, and having to make hard decisions about who you're helping, who you're not, engaging in triage and so on, you simply have to have a certain level of detachment about that. Because otherwise you're going to make bad trade-offs.
Decisions.
You're going to be too taken by something you feel very sympathetic towards, or just whoever's right in front of you, rather than thinking, okay, what's actually the best decision I could be making? And so obviously there's still an underlying emotion there. Like the reason people become doctors is because they want to help other people.
Right.
Similarly, the reason we want to give is an emotional drive, saying we, want to combat the big problems in the world. But then that needs to be guided by their ability to reason, our ability to...
But isn't the first hurdle getting people to actually get into that place of willingness to give? Then it becomes about how you allocate that, right? But if you're pulling that emotional aspect out of it, aren't you isn't that going to have a deleterious impact on the total amount of giving? You know what I mean? Like, it's a psychological thing, right? If you're saying, like, the guy who feels strongly about a certain cause, and then he's told, well, take emotion out of it, then he's like, well, I'm just not going to give. You know what I mean? As opposed to, all right, I'll channel this enthusiasm in a different direction about something that I don't necessarily care as much about.
Yeah. So
is that factored into how you...
Yeah, I mean, so if that was true, that we were just destroying people's intentions to do good, that would definitely be a bad outcome.
That would not be effective altruism.
That would not be effective altruism. But I think there's a couple of things to say. Firstly, in terms of whether we should be trying to get people to give more or to give more effectively, I think there's a couple of reasons to push on giving more effectively. One is just that there's already so many people trying to get others to give more. It's a huge focus on it, where there's not very much on effectiveness. And second is that the difference you can make is much larger. So maybe you could get someone to give 10 times as much if you were really successful at getting someone to give more. But if you get someone to give more effectively, you could easily get them to do 100 times as much good with their donations.
Right. So you have this kind of interesting example that I've heard you talk about before, which is it Books for Africa versus the deworming program. So to kind of play that out, let's say you're passionate about literacy, right? And so your instinct is to give to this organization that is providing books for impoverished African children. And the idea there, of course, is that more books is better. This will improve literacy and classroom attendance and the like, right? But what's the actuality of that?
Yeah, so you'd think, obviously, giving books is a good thing in terms of improving educational outcomes. But when tested, it's actually... I mean, the evidence is very mixed at best. Seems like distributing books, at least in the absence of teacher training, has no benefit in terms of educational outcomes, which is very surprising, but that's what the data says. Right.
So in the sort of counterintuitive example that you used was that they found out that a big reason that classroom attendance was falling off was because a lot of the kids had worms, right? So actually channeling that money towards deworming programs and getting these kids healthy improved attendance, which in turn, I would assume, enhances literacy. So if you're interested in supporting literacy, your money would have been better spent funding these deworming charitable organizations, right?
Yeah, that's right. If you want to improve educational outcomes, if you want to improve life outcomes, deworming is one of the best things you can do.
In this part of the world.
In this part of the world, in sub-Saharan Africa, that's right. And in India. And that's not something you'd ever think of because, no one's had these sorts of intestinal worms in the US since the 50s. They were eradicated. So we don't even know about them, whereas everyone can understand the idea of giving a book. It's easily understandable.
Right.
And deworming is also, it's not a very sexy intervention. It's kind of gross. It's not the sort of thing you want to think about very much.
So when do you found Giving What We Can, which was your first nonprofit?
Yeah, that was 14th of November, 2009.
Right.
Kind of
So
give
you were
what I
like
can.
12 years old.
Yeah, just out the womb.
Uh-huh.
I guess I was 22 at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And that initially, I mean, it was a small affair. There was 23 people who'd taken the pledge at the time. And the
They were
first
like your
party...
friends.
Yeah, many of them were my
Uh-huh.
friends, yeah. And I was aggressively going around talking to people.
Yeah.
And, you know, the launch event was like a fairly small gathering.
Right.
But there was an immense amount of attention and interest. We were the most popular news story in the UK and the BBC.
How did that happen? Did that just organically occur, or was there like a tipping point moment that really foisted that on the public consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, we talked to the University Press Office at Oxford, and they just submitted a press release, and people found the story. I mean, this was especially around Toby, the co-founder, of his pledge to give everything above £20,000 intensely interesting, and it was like the feel-good news story of the day. And it got on the BBC, and then after that point got a very large amount of media attention from other sources as well, around the world, in fact. And that meant that Giving What We Can became a bit of a lightning rod for people who'd had similar ideas but hadn't really acted on them all around the world. And so...
Did that predate kind of formalizing this school of thought called effective altruism, or did these sort of coincide?
Yeah, it predated it for sure. We came up with the term effective altruism in late 2010 or maybe early 2011, simply because by that point we'd realized that there was this key idea combining doing more good and doing it more effectively. And we didn't really have a name. We used so many different things: smart giving, optimal philanthropy, strategic
You didn't think about
altruism.
calling Giving What We Can chugger.com and
Chugger.com, effective chugging.
Yes.
Thankfully, we didn't. But we had been referring to, you know, people that we would now call effective altruists or members of the effective altruism community. We were calling them super hardcore do-gooders,
Yeah.
which is a tongue-in-cheek word, but we definitely needed to move beyond it.
So you go from 23, and then what was that growth curve like?
Approximately doubling every year. So we now have well over 1,000 members,
Right.
Including some people who've, you know, giving 50%, 90% of their incomes.
Wow, 90%.
Yeah, in some cases.
Those must be rich dudes.
I mean, the person I'm thinking of, he's giving about $100 million,
Wow.
which is about 90%.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So before we kind of explore that a little bit further, I want to get it, because I would imagine then with all these people giving pledges, that's what gives birth to this idea of, all right, so how to best allocate this, right? It becomes the next sort of thing that you're going to have to answer to and explore. But before we get into that, you know, I kind of want to explore a little bit, because philosophy is your background and that's what you've studied, the relationship between altruism and happiness, or maybe more aptly put, like self-satisfaction, or you know, a sense of purpose and contentedness, right? And you know, we're in a culture where that's not particularly reinforced. It's more about, you know, accumulating the most material possessions and creating security and comfort around yourself. That's sort of dictated to us, you know, via Madison Avenue or whatever, the television, as being kind of the most well-trodden path to being a happy, contented person. Yeah. And despite the fact that most people intellectually understand that not to be the case, we still propel ourselves forward down that road.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all lies. I think, you know, I think marketing and advertising firms are just continually lying to people about how best to be happy. And now I think the reason for doing good isn't because it'll make yourself happier. I think, you know, the reason to try and help others is because it's the right thing to do. And certainly when I was doing all
but
this...
if you can appeal to people's selfish, you know, natures...
Oh, yeah, then it's a benefit.
Then, and get them to act, like, does the end justify the means in that regard? Like, look, do this. You don't have to be altruistic, but this will make you a happier person if you do this, and you get people to buy into that idea. The impact of that is still the same.
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy with... I mean, I don't... Yeah, if people enjoy helping others and they get a lot of satisfaction out of it, I think that's... Yeah, they're a great person. The sort of person I want to be around. If someone's doing it solely as a matter of duty, then, okay, that's a different psychology. But again, great outcome. I'm in favor of that. And actually, it's more and more evidence is accumulating that helping others is a really good way to buy happiness. And buying material goods is a very bad way of buying happiness. And so we looked into this quite a bit, and we actually think that giving away even most of your income is probably going to have not very much impact at all on your happiness overall, because obviously you've got the loss that you can't buy as much stuff for yourself, but the benefits of then being able to, having the reward and satisfaction of helping others.
Right.
And
but is that a first world problem? You know what I mean? Like, I'm just imagining somebody's listening to this who's struggling to pay the bills. They have kids and they can barely, make their way. To hear that could be kind of jarring.
Yeah. I mean, so it depends exactly what income you're already on. I mean, I think for, people in the middle class who are living in a rich country, then I think pretty much anyone can give 10%. I mean, importantly, basically every member of of rich countries like the US or UK are in the richest 10% of the world's population. If you earn about $50,000 after tax, you're in the richest 1% of the world's population.
Which makes it particularly acute if you're living in the developed Western world in terms of the impact that you can have, because the disparity, the wealth disparity is so severe in comparison to the developing world. That's
what does the work, is because you just have something like 20 times, 40 times as much income as the very poorest people in the world. That means $1 is just worth so much more to them than it is to us. And it means that these very simple sorts of health programs, like distributing bed nets or deworming children, just haven't been funded. You're still able to spend money in that way. And yeah, in my book, I talk about this as a 100-fold multiplier, where we have these good theoretical reasons, and then it's backed up by the data for thinking that you can benefit people in the poorest countries 100 times as much as you can benefit yourself by spending money on yourself. And the analogy I give is like, imagine if you could buy a beer for yourself was $5, or you could buy it for someone else for 5 cents. You'd say, next round's on me. Like,
right.
We'd find ourselves being very generous. And that's the situation we're in all the time.
The problem, though, is that it's not in our consciousness, right? It's just, we're not aware. We don't really think about it because it's so far away, and we feel it doesn't impact our lives.
Yeah.
Like, that's the hurdle, right?
Yeah, that's definitely a big hurdle. And when it does, it feels alien, it feels other. I think often the presentation has been very bad, of just, pot-bellied children starving with, flies in their faces. And
we just glaze over.
And of course you glaze over, you feel put off, you feel like you're being emotionally manipulated. Far better to convey, in sub-Saharan Africa, the incredibly rich, vibrant cultures with people who are just actually, they are pretty happy like a lot of the time, but then get sick in ways that could be, they're people that you would be very close friends with if you happen to know them, if you happen to live there.
And illnesses that could be easily treated or averted through some pretty basic, simple actions.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
And it's not like this, you need this deep emotional appeal. It's just almost common sense that
right.
we should be funding something
Well,
like
I want to take a little bit of a left turn here, because it just, you brought up something that I've been thinking a lot about, which is this advent of conscious capitalism that has sort of become a zeitgeisty kind of thing in our culture, right? Everything from like Tom Shoes to Warby Parker, like all of these companies are realizing that the best way of doing business is to allocate a portion of their revenue towards a charitable cause. And in looking at that, like, I'm interested in parsing out like what aspect of that is truly effective in terms of outcomes, which is what you're interested in, versus marketing hype, right? Because it's good business to make people feel good about buying your product.
Yeah.
And I had, I interviewed Daniel Pinchbeck for the podcast last winter. I don't know if you know who he is, but he spends a lot of time thinking about these kinds of things. And he was like, I think it's BS. I think it's BS. It's marketing spin. And that's not to say that, if that money ends up in a good place and does some good for some people, that's fine. But what it does is it makes people feel good about buying this product, creates brand loyalty. right? And I'm wondering whether you think that then prevents people from exercising that altruism in a more effective way. Because they say, well, I buy Tom's shoes.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't need to give to this charity because see my shoes. I was able to donate shoes to somebody else. And what truly is the impact of that? Is that making a positive difference?
Okay, terrific. Yeah. So I feel deeply.
And I'm not bashing Tom's shoes. Like I like Tom. I like that company. It was the first thing that came to my mind.
Although Tom's shoes is a good example. There have been studies of the program, and kids like the shoes, but it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of education outcomes or any other outcomes you can.
But it puts shoes on their feet.
Measure.
Is that? I mean, that's not a bad thing. I mean,
it's not a bad thing, but you could do better things. I mean, in the initial story where the founders saw these children and they didn't even have shoes. They didn't like wearing shoes. That's why they weren't wearing shoes. So there's
you're gonna get in trouble now.
I might get into trouble. Yeah. But so I kind of feel ambivalent. And one is that I think that really could work, but then it seems to be often misimplemented. I think I agree that very large swathes of this are BS, especially within corporate social responsibility. The reason behind it is marketing and PR, not an honest desire to do good. And then I'm really pleased you mentioned, so what psychologists call a moral licensing effect, where you doing one good deed, especially if it's a very public good deed, so where being able to wear a pair of shoes or something else really shows off that you've done this good thing, depending on the attitude with which you're going into this act, it can make you do fewer good deeds elsewhere.
That presupposes that you have a finite amount of altruism that you're willing to expend.
Yeah, so you can imagine two different reasons why people might want to do an altruistic act. One is like this honest, deep commitment to wanting to do good, and some people have that attitude, I believe. Another, though, is just you want to not get criticized. You want to show yourself to be a good person so no one's going to judge you. And if you're doing that, then if you can do something very salient that very clearly demonstrates you're this good person, then you don't need to do other things as much.
Right.
And so in that way, it could even be getting people to very publicly do a small good thing can, in fact, be harmful. It risks being harmful. I talked about this a little bit with the ice.
I would think psychologically, I want to ask you about that. But what about the idea that if you do something good, it makes you feel good, and then you want to do more good? Yeah, isn't that the counterpoint to that?
So yeah, that's the counterpoint, and that can happen as well. So in the literature, there's just mixed. You can get both effects, and it, I think, depends on how is this being presented and what's the attitude that someone is coming in. So are they thinking, I'm doing my bit, which I think is a very toxic phase. If so, then you're going to get the moral licensing effect. If instead it's conceived of like, okay, well, this is your first step in a path to making this thing really core part of your identity. And there's perhaps follow-up.
Right. Interesting. I mean, extrapolating on this model licensing idea, there's a very interesting kind of analogous idea in the kind of animal rights vegan world right now. There's a guy called Gary Francione who's a professor of law at Rutgers, and he's always butting heads with Pete Singer. Because Pete Singer is somebody who kind of would say that incremental change is good, right? And Gary's taking a very kind of adamant hardline approach, like you either are or you are not. Like you're either an animal right, you're either vegan or you're not. You can't like have it both ways. And he uses this interesting example that's kind of apropos to what we're talking about, in that we're in this period now where it's suddenly very popular to eat grass-fed meat, right? And like sustainably raised, quote unquote, ethically harvested. And the impact of this, according to Gary, is negative in the sense that it's basically making people feel better about making in his mind, an inhumane choice. So it's reinforcing the meat eater's habit, as opposed, so like when you see these posters in Whole Foods where you see the farmers and everyone looks happy and the cows look happy, then when you go and buy your burger, you don't feel that guilt that maybe you would feel otherwise. So it's actually entrenching the behavior that, he would like to see overcome. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
there's something similar about that, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, on that issue in particular, it's something I feel ambivalent about. And I think ultimately I'm happy on I'd endorse the incremental view, at least if it's properly applied, because I think the vast majority of animal suffering occurs on is suffered by chickens on factory farms. Just if you could run through the numbers and you look at the conditions of different animals. So maybe I think that like
No, I hear what you're saying. We got to get you off the dairy though.
Oh yeah,
We'll talk about that later.
But perfectly happy to have a discussion about that. But then, is there the same thing with giving to charity as well? Perhaps people should be taking the hardline approach. I think in our own experience, so Peter Singer was making these arguments that were very hardline, saying, if you're looking at the morality of the situation, you should give everything until you are, living on the same level of income as the people you're trying to help. So you should basically be giving away all of your income.
And does he walk that walk himself?
He gives about 35-40% of his income, which was very significant given, he was the only person doing this. He was kind of Lone Ranger at the time. And now, me and Toby and others like to see ourselves as kind of outdoing him, the next generation. But interestingly, not that many people seem to act on it. The uptick really came on people really acting on these arguments in 2009 with me and Toby, and then the others in Giving What We Can presenting it in this different way.
Right.
Saying, look, okay, well, and I honestly believe this, even if it weren't a moral obligation, it's still this amazing opportunity. Like, it's just part of your own values. Like, think about what it means to live a good life. You have these opportunities to, be the person who, runs into a burning building and saves a child's life.
Yeah, truly aligning your actions with your value system.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, having that coherence is really kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of primary message we put forward, because that's true whether or not you believe it's a moral obligation. And it's something that gets people a lot more excited.
Right.
And I feel like actually the same thing happens with vegetarianism and veganism. There's a very large uptake in people becoming vegetarian or vegan on health grounds. And within the animal welfare community, there's debate about that because, they think maybe people are doing the right thing, but for the wrong reasons.
Right. How important is motivation?
Yeah. And I ultimately think that normally people's beliefs follow their behavior. So I think if you can get people acting the right way, then they'll start to believe the right things as well.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, that's been my experience. I mean, had I've been hearing animal rights activists talk my whole life, and it had zero impact on me. And then I had a personal situation that compelled me to entertain it in a health context. I embraced that. It was positive in my life. And then it's evolved. So now I'm much more interested in the environmental implications and the ethical implications of these choices that we make. And, it's my version of what you're doing in the sense that I have aligned my choices in this regard with my value system. And it's a good feeling, right? But I think in terms of trying to, my responsibility as a spokesperson for this, in the same way that you're a spokesperson for your cause, is how do you effectively communicate people in order to effectuate the change that you're looking for, right? And there's different strategies for that. Some people will hammer people over the head or moralize or judge. And, my approach has always been to create, a very a welcome mat for people where they feel comfortable asking the right questions and, allowing people to have that incremental change, because for me, it didn't happen overnight. And I think for most people, it doesn't. And for the people that say they got hit with a lightning bolt and they changed overnight, I think certainly, I'm sure there's people out there that happened to, but I think, for by and large, for most people, it's a gradual evolution, and you have to give people space to grow into that.
Yeah. And you can, and this is why I think, people like you are great role models for this, because a lot of the reasons why people might think, I'm not going to become vegetarian or vegan is, what will happen to my health or my fitness, or, I'm going to become, have a negative stereotype of what that involves. And so if there are people who are like, I'm running ultra marathons, at the peak performance and being vegan as well.
Right. And you're saying I'm giving away most of my money and I'm actually happy and I'm productive and I'm doing all these interesting things and I feel good about what I do and I'm impacting other people.
Yeah. I mean, my life has gone far better after taking that pledge than it would have otherwise been. I'd be sitting in a library,
there has to have been some challenges, though. Like, I'd really like to get that thing, but what's been the hardest part?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think on the money side of things, actually very little. I mean, I've never moved because I was a student, then a grad student. So I've never moved downwards. I've never got used to a higher level of earnings. Maybe the harder thing was like the amount of time, because I'm trying to spend my time as well as possible. And that means just working very hard on my research on the nonprofits I co-founded as well. And maybe I could have taken a few more weekends over the last 5-6 years. But
all right, so let's get into the calculus that you've kind of developed to evaluate, the charitable options that are available. Like, what are the qualifications in your mind when you look at these organizations in terms of trying to come up with, the best, most effective channel for your funds or for somebody's funds out there who's listening?
Yeah, so I think there are 3 key questions when thinking about charitable giving. The first is the program that the charity works on. The second is how well executed the charity implements the program. And then third is just whether it can actually usefully use more money. And the first one is almost always neglected. People think, you just can't compare across different programs. But that's not really true. Economists have been using tools to be able to do that, like the quality adjusted life year that I mentioned before, that's cashing out the different programs in terms of by how much they're improving people's lives. And so there's a large body of academic research that can help you answer that question. And because, at least in terms of benefiting present day humans, focusing your energy, focusing your resources on especially areas in global health to benefit the very poorest people, tend to be the best ways of doing that.
I think the conventional, sort of average person looks at this and they say, well, how much overhead is there? All this money's going to overhead. I don't want to support that. And you have kind of an interesting, very logical perspective on that.
Yeah, so I think this is just a junk metric. I think it's just so, it's very confused, and I'm annoyed it's been so widely promoted, because if you've got a lousy charity, it's going to stay a lousy charity even if you've got 0% overhead. And so the US Golf Association is a charity, but is that going to do as much good as giving to bed nets? Clearly not, even if it had 0% overhead. And as an analogy, think about if you're buying a product for yourself, you're looking to buy a Mac or a Dell laptop. Would you look at how much the CEOs are paid? Would you look at how much money is spent on overhead or administration versus actual design and building of the products? No. You just look at how much these 2 products cost and how good is the product. And we should think in just the same way for charities. With a certain amount of money that you're giving to the charity, what's the outcome that this charity is producing? If it needs to spend more than overhead to produce a better outcome, then that's great. We should be praising it for doing that.
Right. Maybe paying a CEO quite a bit of money, like a really good CEO can come in and effectuate the most good, would be a prudent business decision.
Yeah,
correct?
That's right. Right.
It's almost, it's kind of a selfish emotional thing, because we want, as a giver, we want to feel connected to the money that we're donating, right? So when it's going towards overhead or rent, we don't feel like our contribution is actually getting to the person who needs it, right? But on some level, that's sort of selfish. Like we want to like see the the hand of that's eating the food. You know what I mean? Like, even if in the meta sense, it's effectuating the most change, it's not giving us that warm fuzzy feeling. Yeah, right.
That's right. And I think there's a kind of puritanical element as well, a little bit, which is that NGO workers should be not taking salaries or taking very low salaries, even if that's counterproductive.
Because they're in this world and it's all about giving back. So how dare you?
That's right. But then if it's counterproductive, then why do we think this?
Yeah. But I think, in contrast to that, we are in a time now where especially young people are demanding more and more transparency in the for-profit sector and in the nonprofit sector. And you see this in the nonprofit sector in the sense that, these organizations are creating that transparency, like track your dollar, and you could see exactly where it goes and da-da-da-da-da. And I think that's a good thing, whether, that's better than not having that.
Oh, yeah. So I think transparency is terrific. And that kind of relates to the second question, is how well is the organization implementing one of these programs. And in particular, is it being honest with respect to the mistakes it's making? So one of the charities that I think does the most good is Give Directly, and it's a very simple program. It just transfers cash directly to some of the poorest people in the world living in Kenya. And their most exceptionally transparent organization. They even have charts that update weekly on what proportion of households had to pay a bribe in order to receive the transfer.
Oh my God.
And the answer is like kind of 2 or 3%. And almost no charity would ever do that, because all charities always have to pretend that everything's perfect all the time. That's never true. True 0 times. And so a charity that's very honest about the obstacles it's facing, that's a very good sign, in fact. When Oxfam published a whole bunch of studies they'd taken showing that many of the programs actually weren't having an impact, I thought more of Oxfam, not less. And so, yeah, this sort of very great transparency is a very good sign. Also, just whether is the organization, being led by really good people? Is it doing monitoring and evaluation, or even kind of trials of its own programs?
And how much does it need your money, right? Like I'm thinking about what happened with the Red Cross and Katrina, where there were massive amounts of cash, getting poured out and it not getting, allocated. It's probably the most famous example of
so that's exactly right.
Misallocation.
Yeah, so that's the final question, is about what I call room for more funding, which is even if a charity is doing terrific work and has done in the past, you don't know that doesn't necessarily follow additional donations are going to be as well used. So an example of this is a polio immunization vaccination. Incredibly effective program. Should definitely put money towards it, except that it's already fully funded by the Gates Foundation. Additional money going to that just isn't actually going to have much of a difference. And the same is often true with disaster relief. Because it's so well publicized, natural disasters get a huge amount more funding than what I'd call ongoing natural disasters, like deaths from malaria, tuberculosis, where I think you can have a much larger impact.
So how do we make this decision, right? Like, how do we find out, like, is this the idea behind the nonprofit that you started? Like, if somebody's listening and like, I have X amount of dollars to give and I want to allocate it best, but I don't even know where to begin. Yeah.
Well, then I think the best thing to do is to go on to the website of an organization that I didn't found, but I support very strongly, called GiveWell. So it's givewell.org. And, they've done the hard work of doing extraordinarily in-depth research to work out what are these charities that do the very most good.
Right. And they kind of started, these guys started kind of with a similar premise as you, right? Like they were like investment bankers trying to figure out, like, all right, where they wanted to make this pledge, but they couldn't figure out where it should best go.
Yeah, that's right. They were working for the hedge fund Bridgewater, and they were giving some of their money and thinking, well, I want to treat this like any other purchasing decision. I want to get my biggest bang for buck. And they started trying to talk to charities and just finding they couldn't get even what they thought of as the very most basic information. Just, what will my money actually do? Do you have any evidence behind this by this program? Why are you choosing this rather than anything else? In fact, one charity that the now CEO, Holden Karnofsky, spoke with was so confused by this that they phoned Bridgewater trying to get him fired because they thought that he must be a spy for a different charity.
Oh, wow.
And that could be the only motivation that he'd have for asking questions.
Do some of the charities try to lobby to get on these lists? I mean, I would imagine it's impactful to their bottom line, right?
Yeah, I mean, Giving What We Can has recommended charities as well that often relies very heavily on GiveWell's research, but sometimes differs. And yeah, we get a ton of people contacting us, trying to make the case.
Right.
I mean, it's never, we just have our own independent research and aren't affected by that.
Right.
Because, yeah, I mean, it's a matter of millions of dollars going to these charities.
Right. And in kind of running this calculus, I mean, there's only, I would imagine, so much scientific method. Like, you're taking philosophical precepts, you're trying to apply logic and math to try to come up with the best options for people. But isn't it more complicated? I mean, we have psychology that plays into this. And then there's certain intangibles, right? Like, what about investing in new technologies where you don't know what's going to happen with that? And what about, political forces that are intervening that you have no control over that could, prevent certain things from happening? Like, how do you approach that or wrap your head around that?
Yeah, so far we've just talked about these kind of more easily quantifiable programs that have short-term effects, like distributing bed nets with the Against Malaria Foundation, deworming children.
That are all kind of fall into this 100x
that's right.
idea that you have.
But by no means do I think they're definitely the best uses of money, because you could do things that are really trying to make big systemic change. And GiveWell are now looking into that in conjunction with a foundation called Good Ventures. These much kind of more uncertain but potentially higher payoff sorts of activities, like policy change, immigration reform, potentially better trade deals, innovation as well.
Biotech,
yeah, exactly. Biomedical research. And so even that first thing, just deciding whether you should fund bed nets rather than direct cash transfers, involves a lot of judgment calls.
Right.
It's definitely not a hard science.
Right. So if you're sitting on $10,000 and you can say, well, I could donate this to an organization that has a 1% chance of saving the lives of 1 million people, or I could donate this money to an organization that has a 100% chance of saving the lives of 10 people. So philosophically, this is a bit of a moral dilemma, right?
Yeah, I mean, and they talk about this in Doing Good Better, and use the idea of expected value. And so I'm pleased you put numbers out there, because then I can say, well, I think the way you should assess decisions like this is to look at the probability of success and how good success would be, and then you multiply it all together. So you said 1% chance of 1 million lives. That's an expected 10,000 lives, 1% times 1 million. And then you said versus a guarantee of 10 lives. Well, that's way less than 10,000.
Right.
And so I think the best way to make decisions in light of uncertainty like this is to look at the probability, multiply it by the value of the success, and then go with what decision scientists call the expected value.
Right.
And that would mean in this case, I think there would be a kind of better answer, which is to go with that 1% chance of saving 1 million lives.
Interesting. And in the research that you've done, I mean, you've kind of come up with pretty concrete numbers of the actual dollar amount that it would take to save a life or support a life.
Yeah,
right?
So our best guess at the moment is a donation of $3,500 to the Against Malaria Foundation will save a life, statistically speaking.
And when you say save a life, like that's sort of an amorphous term too, right? Like what are we talking about?
So what we're talking about is $3,500 will put 600 bed nets over the heads of 1,200 children for 2 years. One of those children, under 5, would have died of malaria had you not done that. So that's precisely what we're talking about.
Right.
And sometimes people hear that and they're like, oh, I thought it cost $5 to save a life. And that's a shame. That's because charities often give these very optimistic numbers. But I think deep down, people often don't believe them. Whereas this is just actually our kind of best guess, even taking into account all sorts of different uncertainty.
Interesting. All right. So we've kind of explored the first metric of effective altruism, which is allocation of financial resources. But now we have time, right? So how do we approach this and figure out how to best allocate this resource?
Great. And this
is the
is
most good.
Yeah. So this, in the story of how I was coming to these ideas, we're now moving from 2009 to 2011. And precisely I'd been promoting this idea of cost-effective giving to charity. But I had all these students coming to me and saying, okay, well, that's all great, but I've got this really big decision coming up, which is, what the hell should I do with my career? And they were asking me, should I just try and get rich and give it all away? Should I work for a nonprofit? What should I do? And I was having to face this decision as well. Should I stay as an academic? Should I go and do something completely different?
This is applied philosophy. This is your opportunity to apply your philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. And in particular, one of these people who came to me and pressed quite forcefully was Ben Todd. He had the options of doing a PhD in climate physics, or he could go into asset management where he could donate a lot. And we gave what was intended to be a discussion group turned into a lecture, which turned into a series of lectures, because in that first lecture, I think a third of the audience changed their career plans as a result of the talk. And then we thought, okay, this is a sufficiently important set of concepts and completely lacking in the world. Like if a young person wants to make a difference in their lives using their time, using their career, they have nowhere to go for advice. Their career service will just give them some mediocre tips on how to make a nice resume. And then the few online sites like Ethical Careers will just say, oh, work in the non-profits. They don't even think about other options. And so we've set up an organization called 80,000 Hours, which is the number of hours you typically work in the course of your life, where the idea is, it's a big deal. It's worth, in general, when you make a decision, you might want to spend 1% of that time working out how to best spend the other 99%.
You'd think, right?
Yeah, you'd think so, but not that many people would spend, 800 hours, 20 working weeks, just sitting down and thinking, okay, what am I going to do with my life?
Right.
So it's really hard to figure out what charities are the best. It's even harder to figure out what career paths are the best. Right. And obviously it's going to be a lot more relative to the person. But we think there's a lot of progress that can be made, at least relative to the status quo. So the standard advice of, if you want to do good, work for the charity, we think is badly wrong in a few ways. So one is just that many charities have no impact when tested. Something like 75% of social programs just don't make a difference at all. Second is that obviously there's loads of good ways to do good outside of the non-profit sector through policy, politics, research, entrepreneurship, and just, the activities of for-profit companies as well, at least depending on the company. So it's, again, a very narrow approach. But then the third thing we think is just, this is also neglecting what we think of as the best path to really making a big difference, which is early on in your career where you just don't have many skills. Maybe you've come out of a good university, but you studied philosophy. You don't doesn't have that much the kind of real-world application. You should really be thinking about leveling up. You should be thinking about making yourself better as a person, being more skilled in order to have a big impact later on. And that might well mean working in a for-profit company or trying to work in some very elite environment, and before then perhaps working for non-profits. And then the very final mistake, I think, is it only thinks about the impact you can have through your labor rather than through your ability to advocate. So like Martin Luther King didn't work for the charity.
Right.
He was a minister who's then able to advocate for this incredibly important cause. Or your ability to donate as well. So again, Bill Gates didn't work for the non-profit. It's done a huge amount of good. I estimate he's saved more lives than everyone in my home country of Scotland. And, that was through his ability to donate. And there are several paths to doing good, and we're trying to work out, for each person, what's the one that's going to have the very biggest impact.
Well, just the simple fact that you're drawing attention to it and mindfulness around these ideas at the outset of a young person's career is potent and powerful in its own right. You know what I mean? Like, it's just the fact that it's part of the discussion, part of the, the mental decision-making process of entering your career. But I would imagine, it gets further complicated. We're living in more and more of a independent contractor world. It's not the world of you get a career and that's where you stay your whole life.
Yeah.
It's like people are having multiple careers and doing many, many different things. So, many careers along the way. And so I'm just thinking, like, how do you, in terms of like providing a service through 80,000 hours, like you've got to come up with some kind of algorithm, right? To provide these options for people to explore. I would imagine that's the heavy lifting of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. And I think a big mistake a lot of people make is thinking of career choice as this all or nothing decision. Something you make when you're 22 and then you have to stick with for the rest of your life. Whereas really we think you should have a kind of career model. So you should think of yourself as like an experimental scientist or an investigative journalist or something. You have a hypothesis about what would make for what's the right career for you. And then you go and test it. And that's like a decision made over like a year or two. And then if it doesn't work, you can go and do something else. And so the careers we often recommend are those that give you a very large base of options from which to go on to other things. And again, that's often a reason for not working in non-profits. It's hard to move from non-profits to other fields. Whereas if you get like an economics PhD, that opens up a lot of doors. If you're working in something like management consulting, or if you learn to code, again, you're just opening up a lot of doors. And so we encourage people, at least to begin with, to work in these
base
things.
skill sets that could be applicable in unforeseen ways later.
Exactly.
Implicit in all of this is, quite a bit of optimism, right?
Yeah.
Like you must be a very optimistic guy to be even tackling this problem to begin with. So how do you sort of communicate with people who are coming from a different perspective? I mean, I feel like, the massive culture feels very disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like their vote doesn't count. What's the point? I'm just going to watch Dancing with the Stars and eat my bag of Cheetos and try to buy the best, biggest screen TV that I can, and I'm going to go golfing on the weekend and call it a life.
Thank you for
right?
listening.
How do you feel? They don't feel like their actions
All right, awesome. Thanks, you guys.
Can have an impact.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things. So in terms of pessimism, like with respect to the world and progress, I think that's just not unfounded. I think not founded at all. I think over the last 200 years, we've just had the most amazing rise in the standards of living of a large proportion of people in the world. And so, efforts to then fight extreme poverty is just how to continue winning in ways that we really haven't done in the whole of human history before. But then secondly, in terms of actually having an impact, I just think it's not borne out by the facts that you can't. I mean, we've seen this over and over again. If, again, coming back just to charitable spending, if you spend your money in the right way, then just 10% can save hundreds of lives over the course of your life. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely huge. And people say, it's just a drop in the bucket. But that's, not really relevant. It's the size of the drop that matters,
actually
not the size of
pulled
the bucket.
10 people out of the ocean who are drowning, that would change your life forever.
Yeah, exactly.
But
it would just stay with you.
We don't feel emotionally connected to it, so it's not the same experience, but the outcome is the same.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think in part of in the way that you communicate or try to sort of compel this change, there has to be a way to psychologically create that bridge, right? Because the psychology is the big part, right? It's like catalyzing the act. Like intellectually, it makes perfect sense. It's logical. The philosophical basis for it is sound. The impact is measurable, right? But there is the psychological barrier to taking the action.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And that's why kind of one of the things we've done is built this community, the Effective Altruism community, which is just community of thousands of people around the world who are just really excited about doing good and doing it effectively as well. And that allows you to get this kind of positive reinforcement because if you do start making changes in your life that are going to do more good for the world, you've got a whole bunch of people around you going yeah, that's amazing. And that's, then suddenly your peers are just kind of rewarding you with being very positive about those sorts of actions. Mm-hmm. And that's not tying yourself to the beneficiaries of your actions, ultimately. You're not being connected with the children you're deworming. But I've actually found psychologically, it's just very powerful as well. I do find when I get up, when I get up in the morning and I'm feeling psyched about my work, or when I'm feeling like most rewarded by the work I'm doing, it's mainly through inspiring people to do more good and just how excited they get by that, rather than the people on the other side of the world that I'm not as connected to.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's again been part of the reason for the uptake of these ideas is that now there's it's a community, it's a group of people who are all together saying, look, we're going to live our lives in a certain way.
Well, that's the advocacy aspect of what you're doing, though. Right?
Yeah.
It's not like your money is going to deworming. That's one aspect of it. But the advocacy and actually catalyzing change in the people that you're impacting, perhaps on a one-by-one basis or by virtue of the talks that you're giving, there's a real sense of accomplishment there. Like that's making a difference. It's like you have some resources going to Africa and the other resources are pushing out in the other direction in a different way through the kind of energy that you're putting out there.
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, I'm hoping for a wide-scale societal shift where people think very differently about, giving to charity is not just this nice thing to do, but altruism or attempting to help others just isn't, you know, I want people to think of that as an obvious part of like significant part of just what it means to live a good life.
Well, you have to make it cool.
I have to make
it
cool.
To be cool to be altruistic. I mean, that's the truth. You know what I mean? It's like you have to make I feel an obligation to make being vegan cool because people you're not going to
pulling it off so well.
Well, yeah, but it's like you're not going to get people to eat this food if it doesn't taste good. Like it's got to actually taste better than what they're eating. You know what I mean? That's how you catalyze change. That's how you attract it. So I feel like you're this millennial, you know what I mean, who has a very powerful message, and it's attractive because you have great energy and you're optimistic, and people want to be like you. You know, it's cool. It's cool to be altruistic, and the more that you can kind of infuse the message with that, you know, I feel like that's a really powerful route.
Yeah, I think you know, and that's the kind of message we want to convey, again, emphasizing just this is an awesome opportunity. It's actually a really amazing way to live your life. It's a way where you're not going to find yourself in middle age just you're thinking, well, you know, I've made a ton of money, but what does it all mean? You know, you wouldn't think, oh, well, you know, I saved 10,000 lives, but like, what was the point? It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah. What about, I mean, do you account for personal development? Like, you know, the Buddha would say that the best way to improve the world is to improve yourself. You know what I mean? Like, you can't help others until you help yourself. So, for example, you know, time spent on self-help or meditation or mindfulness practices, or the time that I spend each day when I get up and I go running or I go to the pool would seemingly not kind of be applicable to this calculus of giving back. But I feel like it's absolutely crucial to me in order to be the best version of who I am so that I am available for the rest of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. I mean, if you're trying to do a lot of good, then improving your ability to do that is incredibly important. I mean, at the extreme, if you're, you know, reckless and get hit by a car or something because you're not crossing the road or not wearing your seatbelt and killed in a car crash, all the good you do in the course of your life is gone.
It's not going to matter, right?
And so I think, you know, the time I spend at the gym or any time I'm spending meditating, you know, that's the most effective use of the time in the day because that enhances everything else.
Right.
And that's why there's often quite a bit of overlap or interest from the effective altruism community also in the kind of productivity, personal development, life hacking, rationality communities as well, because, you know, we've got this aim, just trying to help others as much as possible. Part of that means leveling yourself up, means being a better person. And actually, I found that, you know, one of the surprising ways I wouldn't have anticipated that this has benefited myself is that now you've got this big reason to actually like get out of bed and go to the gym.
Yeah.
It's because you're not just it's not just so that you can yourself have a better life, but it's actually because you have the lives of others.
You're infused with a sense of purpose.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's nothing more powerful than that.
Yeah. Really.
All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the controversy swirling around some of your ideas.
Sure.
Not a fan of the ice bucket challenge.
So
I got you into a little trouble.
It got me into trouble, yeah.
Let's break that down.
I didn't. So that was unexpected. I wrote that article quite quickly.
Oh, come on.
I confess.
Everybody loved the ice bucket challenge.
Everyone loved
why be a hater?
And then I wrote this grumpy article about it. So I was making a couple of points. So one, as we've talked about, was this ethical licensing. The worry that the ice bucket challenge was the most extreme like this, where it's very public. You know, you're pouring a bucket of ice over your head. So very salient action, going out to all of your Facebook friends so you can really demonstrate how altruistic you are. And then donating, I think what ended up being on average relatively small amounts of money, like tens of dollars or something. I think it was meant to be $100, but people would often donate less.
Right. I mean, in the aggregate, what did they raise? Like $3 million?
No, in the aggregate, they raised $100 million.
Oh, $100 million.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. So you're really a hater.
Well, so that will come to the second point. Is then just so that was the first thing. Is you've got to think of that $100 million. How much would have been donated to other charities? What are the other kind of effects? And all I wanted to say is just, well, we need to think before we're kind of lavishing praise on this phenomenon. We need to have an assessment of that and an estimate.
Right. Let's dissect it and figure out exactly what happened and what.
Yeah, that's right. Because it's not obvious that it's net positive. I mean, we always say, oh, it's 100 million raised for charity, but it's 100 million raised, and how much taken from other charities? So, I mean, the amount of funding that goes to charities, or percentage that Americans spend on charitable giving, is pretty constant over time, which suggests that additional fundraising efforts are maybe just eating away at others.
All right, but hold on a second. I mean, I feel like this was, because it was a viral internet moment, that it must have, I don't know, but I would assume that it must have inspired people who ordinarily don't give to give in the moment because they were caught up in the excitement of this. So you're adopting kind of a zero-sum game approach where this is taking money away from other charities. But you could make that argument with respect to any giving, right? Anytime you give, that's money that didn't go somewhere else.
Yeah, or any big fundraising campaign. And I think it just is true that whenever you're raising money, then to some extent, I don't think 100%, but to some extent, that's taking money away from other. But
if you're watching Benedict Cumberbatch get his, get ice on his head, I'm sure there were people who just spontaneously gave $10 who weren't previously, thinking about giving money and just did it in the moment.
Yeah, I'm sure there were some.
And
people
so you're
like
assuming that had an impact on their later giving, but I'm not so sure that that's valid, is it?
Yeah. So the idea is that it impacted some people's later giving. And there is some evidence for thinking that's the case, like the fact that people's giving on average just doesn't seem to change kind of year on year. It just remains at about 2%. And so I don't think all of the $100 million would have been donated somewhere else. So giving what we can, for example, we've raised about $450 million of pledged donations. And we ask people, like, how much do you think you would have been giving otherwise? And we estimate it's about 50%.
Right. But that's unreliable information coming back to you, though.
That's right. Yeah. It might
sort of anecdotally.
Yeah, that's right. It might be too high, it might be too low. Right. But it's also just what you'd expect, is that a certain percentage of money is going to be donated anyway whenever you're doing a fundraising campaign. But crucially, that means, and this takes us to the second issue, is that we simply have to ask the question of how effective is the ALS Association compared to other charities, compared to the average charity. Because if the ALS Association is significantly less effective than charities on average, then if you're doing two things, one is that you're raising, say, 50 million from just out of nowhere would have been spent on ice cream or something, and 50 million that would have gone from other charities. If those other charities are much more effective than the ALS Foundation on average, then you could be net harmful for that reason. And I think there's some arguments for thinking that. So using this metric of quality adjusted life year, I think the estimates that it costs about $200,000 via ALS treatment just to look after someone for a year who's suffering from ALS. With that same money, you could save the lives of tens of thousands of people, I think, or not quite thousands of people. And so, so we just at least, and again, I didn't want to come down as a conclusion, but we at least have to ask that question. And then in particular, when a charity is getting $100 million, is that like final $1 million going to be spent as well as the first $1 million? It's very unlikely, especially when its income is increasing 50-fold.
Explain that idea a little bit.
Yeah, so this is the idea of kind of thinking on the margin is what economists do it, but the idea that just things have diminishing returns. So you have your first coffee in the morning and that, makes you feel really good, kind of perks you up. But if you have to drink 3 or 4, then you start to feel kind of sick, the second one's less good. And in general, just whenever everything has diminishing returns. So you spend your money in the best way that you can. Then when you have more money, you've already used up that opportunity. You can not spend it as well. And so for something like an organization that's getting a vast influx of funds, it's going to not know. Firstly, it might just struggle to spend the money well at all because it's just unprecedented. It's never even thought about how to spend money in this way. Then the second is that even if it does have a good plan, it's simply not going to be able to spend it as well as it spends the initial use of funds. Because
Right. So in other words, let's say the final $10 million, ALS gets 90, the final 10 goes somewhere else that is in much more dire need of that money. The sort of impact in a meta sense is much more profound.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think this relates to healthcare, philanthropic spending on healthcare in general. Something like you're going to do a lot more good by funding malaria treatment or prevention rather than something to do with cancer prevention or treatment because you're giving to countries where people are so much poorer that additional money makes a much bigger difference. And so much less money is already spent on malaria that the lowest hanging opportunity, the best opportunities have still not been taken. Right. Whereas trying to treat cancer is just like this really hard problem.
But by taking this like very, economic, dispassionate approach to this, you're draining all the fun out of it, right? So the ALS challenge was fun. And it goes back to what we were talking about making it cool, right? Yeah, so it was cool to do that. Yeah. People were making fun videos. And I think an intangible in your equation is the long-term impact of people being excited about campaigns that get them to reach for their wallets.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe that campaign has created more people interested in altruism than would have existed otherwise.
Yeah. So that's the kind of alternative. So again, we were talking about ethical licensing versus what psychologists would call foot in the door, the kind of first step approach. And again, I'd be really in favor of that. If we can just kind of raise the altruism waterline of a whole society, that would be a fantastic thing to do.
Right. That could potentially overcome, whatever downside occurred in your perspective as a result of the ice bucket challenge, right?
Yeah, potentially. But it seems to me like it wasn't designed. I mean, it wasn't designed at all. It's just this viral phenomenon.
Right. It just happened.
It just happened.
But I think somebody had a fun idea of doing something and it spread virally. But it's not dissimilar from the skydiving example that you've, cited in the past, creating fun activities around giving, which inherently seems like a good idea to me. You're tracking it to its conclusion though, and seeing holes in that, in that equation.
Yeah. So I think I'm pro it. I'm very in favor of it as long as it's like the first step. So, maybe you get someone to go skydiving for charity and, it's on balance not doing that much good.
And they feel like they did their charitable act for the year.
Yeah, so that's the bad outcome, because if there's no follow-up at all. But if, however, they say, oh, wow, that was terrific, I had loads of fun, and then you say, okay, well, how about you do this additional thing, and maybe something more again. And then it actually starts to feel like, oh, yeah, this was the first step that I was taking. And in the case of the Ice Bucket Challenge, there wasn't that. And again, that's no one's fault, it's because it's just this viral phenomenon. But, people pour water on their heads, and then they go back to their day-to-day lives. I'd be pretty surprised if actually people, like many people were, then significantly changing their life as a result of that.
All right. So a couple other controversial ideas that you have. One of them is around fair trade.
Yeah. So the general idea of ethical consumption, I'm in favor of. Could work in theory, but then fair trade in particular, I think, is just a very bad implementation of that idea, and that's for a few reasons. The first is just that the additional money you spend on fair trade goods relative to non-fair trade goods, of that, a very small percentage actually ends up in the hands of producers, and possibly none of it ends up trickling down to the wages of the poorest people who are the farmers working on, say, coffee plantations.
Right, so it's not a conceptual disagreement, it's an implementation
It's an implementation thing, yeah. And it's just a few ways in which I think it's badly implemented. So that's one. Although that's going to be very hard to get around because supermarkets are going to use this as a way to do what's called price discrimination, which is that you're willing to pay more for an ethical product. I'm going to just charge as much as I can. and I can say, oh, and this is an ethical product, even if a very small percentage of that's actually going to benefit people.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's happening right now with organic labeling. It's become commodified, right? So it becomes a premium brand to have that certification and that label on a food product. And, food producers know this, supermarkets know this, and the governing organization, the USDA, knows this. So then what happens is lobbying efforts are applied that begin to devalue the organic certification. It gets watered down, right? So it doesn't quite mean what it used to mean. And, organizations are charged a lot to get the certification, and they're able to now produce foods that aren't quite as organic as they were maybe 5 years ago, still meet the standard, they can charge more, and it just becomes a business. So the underlying idea behind it is quite good. It's just not quite what people think it is. And I feel like it's similar with fair trade.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I think there are even additional problems with fair trade. So one is, because, that's an example of, for-profits co-opting it.
Right.
And I guess the kind of additional price being charged for fair trade.
Starbucks can charge more if they tell you this is fair trade.
Yeah.
And we don't really spend any time really analyzing what's actually going on.
And
I don't know what is, so I'm not like pointing fingers again.
Yeah. But I think there's even additional problems beyond that. So one is the fact that with fair trade production, it's hard to get a certification. In effect, it kind of costs resources. And so most fair trade coffee production doesn't come from the poorest countries like Ethiopia and Kenya. It comes from places like Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, where, again, they're not rich countries, but they're 10 times richer than Ethiopia or Kenya. And so the additional earnings just aren't doing as much good. And then the final thing is just the way the fair trade model works is by giving $2, or it gives a price premium, a certain amount of money in addition to the market price for the goods bought. And that's great for the fair trade producers. It means they can sell their goods at a higher price. But through the laws of supply and demand, it means that fair trade coffee is going to be oversupplied. It means that non-fair trade farmers are going to be made worse off. And that's why I'm most deeply ambivalent about fair trade.
But isn't that a market force that would compel other suppliers to become fair trade?
There's only if you could have everyone that was fair trade, then you wouldn't have people being made worse off, but you still would have coffee oversupply. So you'd have a lot of coffee going to waste, which would seem inefficient. But at the moment, the vast majority of coffee production is still not fair trade. And so if you do have some people, some producers kind of supplying more than the market wants, that is just going to make fair trade workers worse off as a result, because they won't be able to sell the goods.
I feel like the biggest thing is just the trickle down of actually getting it to the farmers.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what the consumer is operating under when they're making that choice. They want to know that it was fairly produced, which implicitly means that, you're taking care of the actual, not the boss of the, the actual farmers.
Yeah. In particular, compared to just firstly buying just the cheapest, the coffee that's just produced in the cheapest countries, in the poorest countries, where the money's going to go furthest. And then secondly, donating the difference. So cutting out the middlemen, cutting out Starbucks and all the retailers that are taking a cut each time.
Yeah, but
and just giving to
the ass.
Well, it's a simple...
Who's going to do that?
Simple direct... Just buy the cheapest goods. That's easy. Set up a direct debit to give directly, which just transfers cash to the poorest people in Kenya, Tanzania. What could be simpler?
How do you set up that direct? Do you do it? Can you do that through your organization?
Yeah, if you want, you can give to. So, Giving What We Can has a trust, and if you're a Giving What We Can member, you can donate through the trust. If not, you can set up a direct debit through GiveWell, and they'll distribute it to their top organizations. Or, in this case of Give Directly, you could just go straight onto the Give Directly website.
Right. All right. Final controversial subject: sweatshops. What is going on here? Yeah,
so again, I think this is a case of kind of good intentions gone wrong with respect to the attempt to boycott sweatshop-produced goods. And so you had Ryan Holiday on the show recently. He was the chief marketing officer for American Apparel, which, as a marketing campaign claims, okay, we are sweatshop free. We do not use sweatshop-produced goods. We do not use sweatshops. We just only employ people in America or other kind of, like much richer countries. And so people think, okay, I shouldn't buy goods produced in sweatshops. I should buy from American Apparel. But I think that's a very bad outcome for the poor. And
because they're otherwise unemployed. You're saying it's there's either no employment or there's poor condition employment.
That's right. Or they're in worse jobs, prostitution, street hustling, scavenging from dumps. So sweatshops are pretty horrific places. No one's disputing that at all. They're not nice places to work. But extreme poverty is just very extreme indeed. And they're actually the best jobs going around. They actually are the job. They are typically paying much more than other jobs available in the area. And, the people working there are choosing to work there. They're, in fact, often immigrating across borders, risking deportation so that they can work these sweatshop jobs. Mm-hmm. And so if you're taking away those sweatshops, then you're taking away the best working opportunities the people in the poorest countries have.
But to extrapolate on that argument, couldn't that be, it almost sounds like an argument a slave owner would make. It's like, well, I can either, have this guy as my slave, or he'll just be wandering, unemployable and will perish, in the wilderness. So I'm actually doing him a favor by providing him an option and putting a roof over his head.
Yeah.
To give the most extreme, right?
So I think the cases are quite different because the people who work in sweatshops, it's their voluntary choice to go and work there. And in fact, it's, they're enthusiastic about working there relative to the other options. And I agree we want to end the underlying poverty that makes sweatshops a desirable place to work. And that's why I'm, campaign for people to donate far more or to, try and make systemic change. So that we eradicate sweatshops by actually just eradicating poverty. But yeah, it's a voluntary choice that people make to work there. And it's so banning it is just like taking away, banning it is taking away the best option that they have. Whereas in, the slavery case, it's, firstly, the person would have many options to benefit the slave in many other ways. And secondly, if it's an option, if they're like, well, you can do as you wish if you want to keep working.
Yeah, you can be my slave as long as you want to, and if you want to leave, you can leave and not be my slave anymore.
Then that's no longer slavery. But
right. All right. So, by virtue of your logic, I should feel less guilty about the iPhone in my pocket.
Oh yeah,
because there's this weird dissonance. Okay, I'm trying to align my actions with my values, but I still have an iPhone. And I know intellectually that this was produced under circumstances that are less than ideal, that I'm disconnected from. I don't really know what goes on in that factory in China, where I hear rumors. And it's the same dissonance that occurs with somebody who doesn't like the idea of killing animals, but will buy ground beef at the supermarket. It really is no different. You know what I mean? But by your argument, I should say, it's okay that I have my iPhone because these people are employed.
Well, I think it should go the other way, actually. So I think you should take that feeling of kind of moral uncomfort that you have when buying an iPhone and thinking of those horrific conditions, and then channel that to trying to end the underlying poverty. So you wouldn't have had that. You wouldn't have had that discomfort if you hadn't been doing anything. But now you feel somewhat involved. But it can't be morally. But you've benefited people in the course of doing that just a little bit by providing better job opportunities. But that act has made salient actually how bad the lives of some people in the on the other side of the world are. And so I think that's good that we have that moral discomfort, but reacting to it by not, by just saying, okay, I'm going to keep my hands clean and just, then I don't have to think about this at all.
Right. That's the wrong way. Doing nothing is the worst option.
Yeah.
Then it's a distinction between a symptomatic or an underlying causal approach, right? By not buying the iPhone, you're kind of dealing with the symptom. buying it or not buying it. Like you're in this, the factory and the people that are employed there is symptomatic of an underlying cause, which is poverty, right? So actually channeling your resources and your energy towards addressing the underlying poverty would be a better option, in the same way that you would treat a disease by getting at the underlying cause, as opposed to the pharmaceutical that masks whatever symptom is a result of that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
That condition, right?
Yeah.
I like that.
Oh, good. maybe I've got a convert.
All right, cool. So we got to, let's see, how we've been going an hour and a half. Well, we'll wrap it up here soon. So one of the things that's in your book, Doing Good Better, is you kind of have these 5 questions that are basically like the decision tree to entertain when you're looking at, how to allocate your resources. So why don't we just run through those really quickly? So that would be a good way to kind of like cap it off.
Yeah. So the first question, which we talked about earlier, is how many people benefit and by how much? So that's the key, is just thinking about your impact in terms of improvements to people's lives. More people you can benefit by a greater amount, the better. The second question is this the most effective thing I can do? And that's the idea of making the most difference, not just making a difference. Because even among very good ways of doing good, the best are hundreds of times better than just merely good sorts of activities. So you need to always think, not just is this making some impact, but is this making the most impact I can? Third question is this area neglected? So because things in general have diminishing returns, it's vital to focus on the poorest people in the world, or those cause areas that don't get as much attention. US education's an important cause, but so much philanthropic funding already going to it. It's hard to make a big difference. Fourth question is, what would have happened otherwise? And that question says the difference you make is the difference between how much good you do and how much good would have been done even if you hadn't acted. And I talk about the impact a doctor has, where, as a doctor, you're saving lives every single day, but for most of those lives, they would have been saved anyway, even if you hadn't taken that job. And so the actual impact you have, the difference you've made to the world, I think is much less than you might intuitively think by becoming a doctor. And then the final question is, what are the chances of success and how good would success be? And that's a crucial question when you're thinking about uncertain ways of doing good. Things that maybe won't pay off but might have a really big impact, like systemic change or something other than these concrete, measurable ways of doing good. And that's this concept called expected value, multiplying the chance of success by the value of the success if you do it. And that provides this way of thinking about systemic change. And then those are the kind of 5 underlying questions. If you're thinking like that, you're thinking like an effective altruist. It's the kind of power tools for doing good. And then the second half of the book applies that to doing good through charity, doing good through career, doing good through your consumption, and thinking about what are the most important causes, what are the biggest problems in the world, the ones we should be really trying to tackle.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, the book is really great. It definitely changed the way that I think about all of this. Certainly changes how I perceive, the world of charitable giving, and I would recommend everybody check it out. It's very cool, man. It's you've done a great service by putting this out there.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's cool. And if you're inspired by Professor MacAskill and interested in learning more about giving, I mean, you can go to Giving What We Can and learn more about what that organization does. And if you're interested in trying to figure out how to allocate your next gift, givewell.org, that's a good place to go too, right?
Yeah, that's right. And if you want to do good through your career, then 80,000hours.org is the place to go.
So I took the test. I did. It said I should be a politician or a startup entrepreneur.
I think both of those things are pretty good for you.
Yeah, so. I don't know. I need the big idea for the startup entrepreneur, though. So I can come back and do what you're doing, which is participating in YA Combinator. So why don't we cap it off with that? So you're here. We're in Mountain View right now, just down the street from Stanford, and you're participating in a very prestigious sort of venture capital, how would you describe it? Compendium. It's not a conference, but it's sort of like all these startups. Well, you've been invited.
It's like an accelerator for new startups, or an incubator, so it's a way of taking early stage startups and really getting them off the ground. And it's produced companies like Dropbox, Reddit, Airbnb, And so it's the kind of premier accelerator in the world. And recently they started taking nonprofits, and we're one of them. So
yeah, how many nonprofits have gone through there? Not many.
Yeah, less than 10, I think. I think out of 100 companies in this batch, 4 nonprofits.
Right.
And so, I think Y Combinator are definitely still trying to figure out exactly, still finding their feet with nonprofits, because obviously it's a very different set of standards than the for-profits. But there's similar things that apply to both, and this has been one of the most valuable learning experiences of my life, I think.
It's pretty cool. Because so they mentor you, but there's also a little bit of a competitive dog and pony show, right? Where you have to get up there and you got to pitch in front of like a pretty intimidating audience of potential investors, et cetera.
Yeah, so it all culminates in demo day, where all the companies stand up, they pitch for 2.5 minutes to 450 investors. And then afterwards, there's this crazy meat market where everyone tries to meet everyone else. And the startups are looking for investment, we're looking for donations. And there's a little app so that investors can like different companies, and then you'll get an email sent, and you can be in touch afterwards.
So how'd it go? You already did that part, right?
Yeah, we've done that part. Went really well. So it was Ben Todd, the CEO of 80,000 Hours, that was presenting, and I thought he nailed it, which I was happy with. And then, I had a bunch of people really interested in what we were doing, in particularly as a donation opportunity. We did set up 80,000 Hours with the intention of being the most cost-effective charity in the world, because, we're encouraging people to work on the most important causes or donate to the most cost-effective charities.
Yeah, you better walk that walk, right? If you're saying make sure you understand where your money's going and that it's actually having an impact, and then you're saying, please donate to us.
Oh yeah, so we're very, we're very aware of that, especially given, they could be donating to these amazing first-order charities, but we're like a meta charity. We're kind of like we're raising resources for the most effective causes and most effective charities.
You're fertilizing future effective altruists.
Yeah,
right?
That's partly what we're doing. And making the people who are already trying to do good more effective, because they're having better knowledge about what to do with their life. And so, we think that money coming in through us is like a 10-fold or maybe 100-fold multiplier or something. So it's like an investment. It's like a way of getting leverage in your donation.
Right. And from here, you're almost done here, and then you're heading off to Oxford.
So I'll very shortly be going back to Oxford, where I'm starting an associate professororship.
What are you going to teach?
So I'm teaching ethics, political philosophy, as you'd expect.
Yeah.
I won't merely push effective altruism. I'll be much more impartial than that. But I'm very lucky to be starting at Lincoln College, Oxford University.
So it's undergraduate?
Yeah, undergraduate and graduates, And the Oxford systems.
You're going to be teaching people that might be older than you.
Yeah, that's probably true. Which, even with the undergraduates, I don't feel so different than when I walked into Cambridge age 18, so I'll need to be...
Yeah, well, I don't either, but, that's how it goes.
Well...
That's an interesting dynamic, though, to be you're essentially a peer, right?
Yeah, obviously I'm going to have to try and create this... create a dynamic where, I am the tutor and...
Costuming.
Yeah, a little bit.
Right.
So I won't be wearing this T-shirt. I'll be, wearing a nice shirt and so on.
No Chuck Taylors.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think there's also real advantages there. Like I actually know, can really remember, it's very salient, what it's like being, turning up at Cambridge so scared, suddenly surrounded by all these people who are so high performing, and, it's very easy to beat yourself up, very easy to feel like an imposter. And so I think that the kind of empathy still being quite young will give me is going to be an asset in terms of teaching.
Well, good luck, man.
Yeah, thanks.
Your work is inspiring. I can't wait to see, where this all leads for you. And I appreciate your time, man.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, it's cool. So, all right, if you're digging on Professor MacAskill, I'm going to create a little formality here. You can go to his website, williammacaskel.com, or you can go to 8000hours.com. You can go to givingwhatwecan.org. And also, maybe most importantly, effectivealtruism.com if you want to get involved and figure out how to create community around these ideas where you live. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's right.
Cool. Is there anything else? You're at Will MacAskill on Twitter.
At Will MacAskill on Twitter, and the book, Doing Good Better.
Doing Good Better, of course.
A Guide to Effective Altruism. It's out now.
Yeah, definitely pick it up where all books are sold. All right, cool, man. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Peace. Lance.